we can take you now to the Supreme Court of Appeals in Bloemfontein, bring in senior politics reporter Ziyanda Ngcobo, who's been listening in to those proceedings. Ziyanda, let's go back to the issue of the role of the Medical Parole Advisory Board and whether, shall we say, its recommendations are binding.
Absolutely, and I mean that's the nub of Dali Mpofu's arguments this afternoon, to say an advisory board is exactly that. Many ministers and deputy ministers have advisors, but whether or not they take that advice is something else. But in fact, Justice Dambuza hitting back to say, well, Dali Mpofu, it's not quite the same thing. And really, Dali Mpofu arguing that the basis of their argument is on Section 75 of the Correctional Services Act, which deals then with the powers, the duties, and the functions of the Medical Parole Board, where Section 17 of the Commissioner, I beg your pardon, where Section 79 deals with the role of the Medical Advisory Board. And Mpofu arguing that these two sections should be read together. So not much difference between Mpofu and Mpahlele, who's representing the Correctional Services Department, in terms of their arguments. One on the issue of the redacting of parts of the former president's medical records. In fact, Dali Mpofu saying by virtue of the former president being exactly that, a former head of state, it's a document that should be classified. But also then this issue, Tembekile, of whether or not, and categorically stating as per the conditions for granting medical parole, if Zuma was in fact one, terminally ill or physically incapacitated, remains a large part of the debate this morning, and the arguments to say where does it state, either in the medical reports or even then the reasons for or the decision that Fraser took when granting medical parole, that it was either of these two preconditions.
The issue of the the various reports, the one by what came out of the advisory board that was dealing with the issue of medical parole, and the actual grounds for release provided by the former Commissioner Fraser, has also been central to the arguments today, a comparison of what was said, what was left out.
Exactly. I mean, Dali Mpofu was quoting the Helen Suzman Foundation to say, they themselves defined it as a terminal disease. And then Justice Mahoka saying, just because the Helen Suzman Foundation has repeated what has been argued, it doesn't necessarily mean that they agree with what's been said. But also, Tembekile, the reason why this has come into question is because the Medical Advisory Board had said that they believe that the former president was stable. But Arthur Fraser chose to take the advice of one of the doctors on that advisory board, which said then that the former president's illness was deteriorating, combined with the reports then from the Military Health Services Dr. Mafa, who also said made a similar finding that the former president would need special attention. Even the issue of whether or not the Escort correctional facility would have the correct and enough capacity to be able to attend to the kind of condition that the former president faces is also something that came into question. You would have even heard Dali Mpofu saying, that the issue of the redaction of the medical records, it's something that came after, Arthur Fraser had made his decision, but he had used the information at his disposal to make that decision, saying that he could not have been a Sangoma and predicted that they would write to him to say that parts of the medical records should be redacted. Justice Dambuza hitting back to say, Fraser doesn't need to be a Sangoma, but he does need to stipulate and outline the factors upon which he made his decision, which is actually the nub of why we're in court today. Was Arthur Fraser rational and acting according to the law and the powers that he has been given by the Correctional Services Act to override a decision by the Medical Advisory Board which stated otherwise?
Of course, for the Correctional Services Department, where Arthur Fraser is no longer posted, of course, at the moment, said it cannot be said that his decision was irrational. But in previous court documents, one of the other issues that had come up when it came to whether or not the former president was seriously ill, was about why it is that when he was granted parole, he went back to his home in Gandla rather than somewhere closer to a tertiary hospital, for example, where he'd be able to get treatment rather speedily if indeed his condition was so grave.
Exactly, and they've cited, when I say they, I'm referring to Arthur Fraser. In fact, there was an affidavit, or I should say a document that was signed by the former president's first wife, saying that she would also, be personally tending to the former president and dealing with this issue of medical parole at Nkandla. But also, Tembegile, another critical issue that has currently been argued before the court is the request by the Helen Suzman Foundation that the term or the amount of time the former president has spent out on medical parole, if this court upholds the previous decision to say that it was wrong for him to even be granted that parole, that the time he spent outside not be counted as a part of the 15-month jail term. And in fact, you would have heard an argument to say that that would be double prejudice and jeopardy against the former president. Dali Mpofu really quoting there, another constitutional court judgment, section 35 of the Mpahla case, where he said that it could be argued that medical parole is a privilege. However, parole is still a manner of serving out one's sentence, and it still brings about limitations on liberty, so it doesn't detract from the fact that it's still a form of punitive measure.
So what happens after lunch, Ziyanda? Advocate Mpofu will be back again, right?
We're expecting that there are going to be other arguments from AfriForum, the Democratic Alliance, whose leader John Steenhuisen is also in court today, as well as the Helen Suzman Foundation, who of course would be opposing then these arguments that you would have heard by Dali Mpofu, as well as Moribola Mphahlele, who is representing the Correctional Services Department.
Ziyanda Ngcobo, senior politics reporter, live for us in Bloemfontein inside the Supreme Court of Appeal. For now, Ziyanda, thank you.